William Robinson is our distinguished senior editor at LAP and has participated in many of the ideas behind some of our issues, particularly, for example, the debate on the nature of the regime in Nicaragua, and um, accomplished scholar. And I think you are at UC Santa Barbara to this day, yes?
Yes,
Good to know. Go ahead and let us know what your insights are on this particularly difficult time.
sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And the first thing I'm going to do is set a timer for myself. I'm going to set it for, well, it's set for 25 minutes. And if that rings and I'm not done, it means that I'm going to wrap it up at that point. And I want to explain that I am going to make reference to Trump and Latin America and its impact, of course, but I actually am going to slightly change the focus here. And I'm also want to reiterate something I said earlier today to Ron on the phone, and that is an apology because he contacted me shortly before last month's meeting and suggested that I give this talk last month, and I had a prior commitment, so we agreed that I would do it at this time. And I forgot to put it in my calendar. And when I looked at the agenda this morning, I said, oh my God, and I didn't really have time to prepare a separate presentation, but I did have something prepared, and it's of course burning, cutting edge, and it's very related to Latin America. So I'm going to give that presentation. It will make perfect sense just now as I get started, and make reference as I go along to Latin America. So what I want to do here is to present the big picture that frames the current global conjuncture, the U.S. Latin American conjuncture. And I'm going to try and paint this big picture in very broad strokes, which will mean I'm synthesizing and I'm simplifying. And I'm suggesting that at the deepest structural level, what is the underlying fundamental background to everything going on right now in the world, to Trumpism, trade wars, fascism, genocide, the resurgent Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, is the epical crisis of global capitalism. It's a crisis which is really without precedent and has these four interwoven dimensions that I want to highlight. One of them, obviously, is the collapse of the biosphere, and that makes the crisis existential. But I won't refer to that here. I want to refer to the other three. And that is that the first dimension of these other three is structural or economic. The global economy is in a deep crisis of overaccumulation. Secondly, global capitalism is facing a severe, really an unprecedented crisis of social reproduction, of social disintegration and collapse all over the world. And the third, we're facing this severe political crisis of state legitimacy, of capitalist hegemony, and of geopolitical conflict. So these four dimensions are really coming together to create an absolutely explosive situation. And we, of course, focus on the headlines and what's going on day to day, but this is really the larger background that frames all of that. So let me make reference to this structural dimension of overaccumulation, because we have seen a decline in the rate of profit worldwide. Occasionally it picks up, it lowers. Some countries, the rate of profit is higher and then goes down and so forth. But the global rate of profit has been on a steady decline since the 1990s. Global markets are saturated. The global economy is facing this chronic stagnation. There's massive industrial overcapacity, and that overcapacity also explains part of these dynamics of the trade wars and China and the tariffs. But the point is that this severe and getting worse crisis of overaccumulation brings about this intense pressure for expansion, for transnational capital to expand around the world. And what I refer to as the transnational capitalist class has been in this desperate search for where to continue to unload overaccumulated surpluses, how to crack open new opportunities around the world for capital accumulation. And so what we're seeing, and of course this very much involves Latin America, is a new worldwide round of really violent and predatory extractivist expansion, especially extractivist expansion to seize resources and to throw down the infrastructure to have access to resources and to markets. So this is, I mean, we can see this campaign to seize resources all over the world, and including in Latin America, and to create these new spaces for transnational capital accumulation. So, you know, this is really the structural part of the story for what's going on in Gaza, in Congo, in Mexico, in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Venezuela right now. And there's actually three countries that are the countries that are, most experiencing land grabs right now. Peru is in very first place. And beyond that, after Peru is Malaysia and Indonesia. So all of these different things going on around the world, they are linked to this violent period of capitalist expansion in the face of really intense crisis. And of course, this wave of extractivist expansion is generating all of these conflicts. This process of seizure and expansion is extremely conflictive and involves a lot of displacement. And here is a point I want to make here, that the process of expansion itself and the displacement itself that it involves is enormously profitable itself. In other words, it's profitable to get resources, to get Venezuela's oil, to get lithium from Bolivia, to get all of these minerals from the Congo. That itself is profitable to seize those resources. But the process, the military and the violent process of seizing them is itself a new and dynamic source of profit for a global economy in extreme stagnation. And this is what I've called in my work militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. And in a double sense, this is wildly profitable. One is, we all know this, that every time an immigrant in the United States spends one night in a private for-profit run immigrant detention center, the government pays that corporation $700. So it's profitable to repress. It's profitable to carry out military actions. But secondly, the repression and the military and the violence itself opens up space for accumulation, for seizure of resources, and so forth. So the point is to take the example of the intensification of the war on immigrants. It certainly is not started by Trump. We know that very well. It's a massively profitable operation. The two corporations we're all familiar with is Geo Group and CoreCivic. Biden, by the way, it's a shocking piece of data, but again, there's a qualitative rupture between Biden and Trump, but in a different sense, politically, not in terms of the actual amount of violence and repression that it involves. Biden gave out 21,000 contracts to private corporations to wage a war on immigrants during his last 4 years in office, and he deported more people than Trump did in his first term. The Homeland Security budget for immigrant enforcement is going up now to $30 billion. And what we're seeing here also, and we're going to see how this is important for Latin America and for the conjuncture, is that in all of this violent predatory expansion and extractivism, including the war on immigrants, there's a fusion of the state, in this case, the US state, but more generally, a fusion of states with private capital in new ways, especially private military. So Blackwater, as we speak, is in Ecuador. We're all following the headlines. Eric Prince was in Ecuador for the elections, before the elections. His mercenary forces literally fused with the Ecuadorian military. And you know that Noboa declared a state of exception a year and a half ago. And that's very significant because that's the face of moving forward the future. We're going to see, if things don't change, the declaration of states of exception all around the world. And Prince also campaigned for Noboa. So this is part of a story of these transformations taking place in the face of the crisis. U.S., to give a few more pieces of detail here, U.S. arms exports reached an all-time high of $318 billion. That's a 29% increase in 2024 over 2023. Another example, again, because I think it's extremely important, the concept of militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression in response to the unprecedented crisis of global capitalism. El Salvador, as you know, is now getting paid millions of dollars to lock up transnational prisoners. That is accumulation by repression. All over the world, though, it's not just the US. Trump, by the way, proposed a $1 trillion military budget. Just about a week and a half ago, he made that proposal. But we're seeing a rapid increase in military budgets all over the world, and this intensified militarization of the global economy and society. We really do have a global war economy right now. You may remember, or maybe not, that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the first thing that there was a spokesperson for all of the military industrial corporations, which were now getting new orders to produce weapons to go to Ukraine. The spokesperson said, well, this is fantastic. Happy days are here again. And I cited in some of my articles the CEO of Goldman Sachs. When the genocide started in Gaza, that chair said, this is fantastic for our portfolio. So sort of these comments are really reflecting just how how significant is the crisis, the structural crisis of overaccumulation, and how central is the militarized accumulation by repression, and this is very much active in Latin America, and it's intensifying with Trump. So this is both a strategy of accumulation, and it's also a strategy of containment of surplus humanity. New strategies of social control. So that leads me to the second of these three dimensions of the global crisis and its impact in Latin America that I want to mention. And the alter ego of surplus capital has always been surplus labor, with what I'm referring to now, myself and others, as surplus humanity. And the point here is that what I call the transnational capitalist class has no need for the social reproduction of major sectors of the global working and popular classes all around the world. Some 2 billion people are now completely marginalized, expelled from global economy and society, and simply surplus for capital. They don't generate surplus value. They're not integrated into the directly into the circuits of exploitation. They don't consume, or not a market, and they have a potential rebellion. They're potentially very so-called dangerous classes. And what we're seeing is with the digital revolution, and I cannot emphasize strongly enough the significance of the digital transformation taking place now. We're really seeing this radical restructuring and transformation of global capitalism driven by digitalization, which is revolutionizing the forces of production and altering the relationship of transnational capital to labor and to the state around the world. And it's also involving the very rapid and massive expansion of the ranks of the surplus population around the world. And I want to emphasize something here, because we read something today, and because digital transformation is so rapid, within a few months, it's outdated. A few months, things have changed. So when I talk about the expansion of surplus population through especially artificial intelligence and the digital technologies, it's not just industrial workers that are becoming surplus, and it's not just in the global south. It's as much all around the world, and it involves also the so-called, whether we want to call them knowledge workers, highly skilled workers, professional managerial class, whatever language we want to use. This is not just the manual labor and not just industrial labor in the south. There is a general precaritization and expansion of surplus labor at all levels. Artificial intelligence is sweeping away both skilled and unskilled labor, mental and manual labor. And again, I want to stress, because this can't be understated, this is not hyperbole and it is not the future. It is right now. And it's in the global north as well. Artificial intelligence now generates its own algorithms. That is a qualitative radical change from the type of digital technologies we've had for the last 50 years, the computer and the internet, which themselves had incredibly transformative effects on global economy and society, including, of course, Latin America, which is what we focus on. China now has fully what are called lights out factories, meaning that there are no lights in these factories because there's no human beings, 100% automated. And these factories are making iPhones, and they make an iPhone a minute. Or there might be a second, I don't even remember. But like a radical speed up of the rapidity with which iPhones are made in this lights out factory. Even mining, there is now fully automated mining and port activity for exports for coming out of China. So all of this presents this incredible challenge for the ruling groups. How do you contain surplus humanity? How do you maintain control over a restless working and popular classes in Latin America and around the world? And the answer the ruling groups come up with is these nightmarish strategies for containment. One of these strategies is what I call the Gaza option, outright genocide. Now, you might say, well, this has to do with Zionism and political issues in the Middle East. Well, in the immediate sense, yes. But in the larger story, and I don't have time to go into this now, but in the larger story, Palestinian proletariat has become totally surplus, useless for global capitalism, just standing in the way of the seizure of resources in Gaza, of gas, of real estate, of oil, of building a new canal. The plans are already underway for that, of this massive expansion throughout the Middle East. The surplus Palestinian proletariat is standing in the way of the normalization of Saudi Arabia relations with Israeli relations, which in turn is going to open up the whole Middle East to a new massive round of transnational corporate penetration. So that's the Gaza option of genocide. And we also see that elsewhere in the Congo, in Sudan, in other places. The second option the ruling groups have to contain surplus humanity is what I call the Salvadoran option, the mega imprisonment. And we're seeing these mega imprisonment geography spreading all over the world. After the Seco, now everyone knows because Trump is sending, people there, but that was opened in March of 2023. And shortly after it was opened, many governments around the world said, we're going to open mega prisons. Sri Lanka, India, China, Brazil, Pakistan, all over the world, Turkey. I think the biggest one that I read about is in Sri Lanka with 60,000, it's either Sri Lanka or Thailand, with 60,000 prisoners. Now, if you think of all the people involved in housing as 60,000 prisoners, you're talking about a cities of mega imprisonment. And this is wildly profitable, of course, but it's resolving the political problem of what you do with surplus humanity. That's the Salvadoran option. And then, and that's expanding. And remember, the foreign minister of Costa Rica went, I think it was about 2.5 weeks ago, went to El Salvador when the first prisoners from the U.S., immigrants from the U.S., Venezuelans were put in that prison in El Salvador. The Costa Rican foreign minister flew to San Salvador and he visited the prison and he went back to Costa Rica, to San Jose, and he said, that was fantastic. We love what the Salvadorans are doing. We're going to open a mega prison here. So that's option number 2 for the ruling class, is the Salvadoran option. And then the third, which is taking place everywhere, including in the U.S., is the expansion of what I've been referring to as the global police state. This dramatic expansion of ubiquitous systems and new modalities for mass surveillance, social control, and repression. We can also look at Ecuador and what's taking place in Ecuador, which was, again, you have really paramilitary forces, which supposedly the state is fighting the paramilitary forces, the cartels, but that conflict gives the state the opportunity the justification to declare a state of exception. And what do you do under the state of exception? The state intensifies its regime of repression and control of surplus and precarious labor in the popular classes rebelling in Ecuador. And then comes in Eric Prince and the mercenaries, and comes in Trump, and it all combines in this deadly new expression of the global police state. Inside the US here, this war on immigrants is obviously it's fascist class warfare from above, aimed at 2 things: mopping up and expelling those that are not needed, and dividing and disorganizing the working classes here and elsewhere around the world. But I want to point something out. Those that are deported are not random. Besides the Venezuelans that have been deported and sent to Secot in El Salvador, a study just came out a little while ago showing that those deported are unionists. They can be undocumented or documented migrants, but they belong to unions, and some of them are organizers. Garcia, who is rotting right now in El Salvador, he belonged to a union, and he was being trained by his union to increase his skill set. And Lalo, the union organizer from Washington. So we've discovered, not me, but I read the article, that this is not random whatsoever. This is a massive attack on the US and the global working class, starting with its most vulnerable sector, migrants. But the larger project of Trumpism is, and this has been all over Latin America, of course, this is not new in Latin America or here, but it's to smash what remains of the regulatory state and the social welfare state. That is Milei's chainsaw metaphor. The chainsaw smashing anything that still remains of regulation and of social welfare. And so this is intended to culminate 50 years of capitalist globalization and of neoliberalism to now transfer very much more rapidly. Here's the qualitative escalation that I mentioned that Trump represents. Transfer very rapidly the cost of the crisis onto the working and popular classes, offset the decline in the rate of profit with intensified exploitation involving an attack on unions, pulverizing salaries, and so forth. So we have this direct linkage between what Trump or the regime is doing here in the US and what Milei is doing, and the 2 of them linking up and so forth, this qualitative acceleration. And then one of the key dynamics here is displacement, despojo, a dramatic expansion of displacement. And again, not just in the global South. We have to see that the firing of 200,000 civil servants in the United States within a question of a few days, or maybe it was 2 weeks, 200,000, that is massive displacement. And so what we are headed to in the United States, it's like I have 5 more minutes till I get to the 25-minute point. What we're headed to here in the United States, this is very important because this war on immigrants, again, is a war on the whole a global working class across borders, and really intense here on the migrant labor here really is a sign that we're talking about transnational labor, not nation state labor. But here's the thing. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Emirates, etc., they have what's known as the kafala system. Now, the kafala system is when some of those countries, like Kuwait, the majority of the population are transnational migrant workers. And citizens, Arab citizens, is a minority of the population. But those transnational migrant workers, they're recruited by transnational labor recruiters. They come in with a visa only to work in a specific location. Their passports are very often taken away. They live in barracks. Basically, it's modern slavery. It's 21st century slavery. Many of them die on the job. Building the World Cup a couple years ago, thousands died in the heat from heat stroke in the job building the World Cup. If they rebel, if they try and organize a union, then they're immediately expelled. So that's the system that Trumpism is trying to install in the United States. And it's moving quite rapidly. So the visa type is H-2A. H-2A is when you're specifically recruited by an employer. When the employer is done using your labor, you are out again, which is why Trump said about 4 or 5 days ago, the agro-industrial enterprises said to Trump, we need labor. Well, don't make them leave. And Trump said, don't worry. And they have to go out and come back in legally, meaning they have to come back in with H-2A visas, meaning the kafala system, the Gulf system of modern day slavery. So all of this, of course, is radically impacting Latin America in many different ways, because Latin American migrant worker migration to the United States has been an escape valve for the buildup of political tensions in Latin America. Imagine there's no more out migration from Honduras, from Nicaragua, from El Salvador. That's going to be explosive politically and economically. And also remittances going from the United States and elsewhere back to Latin American countries have been propping up economies which otherwise would be collapsing much more quickly. Worldwide remittances are 900 officially, because we know there's other ways of transferring that's not recorded. Officially, according to the World Bank, worldwide remittances of migrant labor is $900 billion, almost $1 trillion. That's official. And for Latin America, which is the region that gets the most of these remittances, is $300 billion. For Mexico, it's $63 billion. For the Central American countries, $45 billion, and so forth. So this is really a system of transnational migrant slavery linked to a whole lot of other issues, which I don't have time to go into. So I'm at 22 minutes. I'll conclude my third of these dimensions of crisis that I want to focus on is that of the political crisis of state legitimacy, capitalist hegemony, geopolitical conflict. And I had mentioned that the structural crisis of overaccumulation creates these incredible pressures for outward expansion, for opening up new spaces of capital accumulation. And of course, this relentless pressure for expansion means an incredible increase in instability and conflict in all directions, everywhere you go. And that's part of this integral to the story of what's taking place right now in Latin America and worldwide. The ruling groups everywhere, there's ruptures within the ruling elites everywhere. There's a crisis of hegemony in the power blocks themselves that run states, and there's also a more general crisis of hegemony. The global elite is extremely divided, and that divisions are rupturing into outright conflict, political, in some cases, military conflict. There is intense state competition over markets. And I want to stress something here. We can discuss this and we can debate this. When as soon as I'm done here, we can debate this, but I'm going to stress that we don't want to confuse this state competition with competition among national capitalist classes. That is a very, very mistaken analysis and empirically not sustainable. We have to see here the specificity of the political within the context of this global crisis. The transnational capitalist class has come out against Trump's tariffs. Here in the United States, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Association of Manufacturers, National Association of Manufacturers, and all of the big business groups, they've all come out against the tariffs. So these tariffs and the impediments of state competition, that's not being supported by much of capital. And this notion of Trump is going to reindustrialize the United States, one, that's a ridiculous fantasy. We know that we have a globally integrated system of production, finance, and services, and we know that involves vast supply chains and interconnections, interlinkages all over the planet. So one, there'd be no migration of industry back to the US. It's very contradictory. And of course, we have to discuss the contradictory nature of this crisis and of the Trumpist response, the fascist response. But in any case, so that's 5 minutes, that's 25. So I mentioned I'll wrap it up now, talk no more than 30. So even if industry did come back, it would be automated. It's automated and robotized industry, so it won't resolve the crisis here or anywhere else. But here's the point. The picture is really more complicated than realism. Steve and I were critiquing and commenting a couple months ago on realism. It makes important contributions, but it also has major limitations. So one of the things that's happened, why is Trump having this newfound aggression and tariffs on Mexico? Well, part of the story is because a lot of industry has migrated in the last 10 years from China into Mexico in order to export from Mexico to the US. You're all familiar with that story. But what happens is what's being set up in Mexico and what goes into Mexico through the back door of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or whichever it's called now, are parts that are then used to make Ford or Volkswagen inside Mexico and so forth. So it's a complicated picture of transnational capital and its flows and connections around the world. But here's the point I want to make on this, including points on crisis of state legitimacy and so forth, is that states all around the world, including the US state, the most powerful state on the planet, has extreme dependence, and societies have extreme dependence on digital technologies, and therefore on those that produce, manage, and control these technologies, and those corporations and billionaires that have the knowledge to develop and apply these technologies. So states are subordinated to transnational capital, but in this case, increasingly to the new emergent hegemonic block of capital, which is tech capital combined with finance and combined with the military-industrial complex. So Starlink is Musk's private corporation for satellites, and it's Starlinks which gives the Ukrainian forces all their intelligence on the ground. And so a private global tech billionaire can control war and peace in Ukraine. So we have to see this all around the world. Again, I'm simplifying things. Southcom, so in Latin America, the US military command for Latin America is totally dependent on the private tech corporations and on this technology. So the institutions of bourgeois democracy cannot manage the crisis. They are seen by this, by the new emerging power bloc, democracy, as obstacles to capitalist expansion. So what we're seeing in the US, around the world, the new authoritarianism, 21st century fascism, far right populism, all of these are different forms of response to the crisis of global capitalism involving novel modalities of control over civil society and new state forms which are emerging. So we have Trump, Milei, Bukele, Noboa, Netanyahu, Erdogan. They're putting forward new political dispensations. And we're seeing in these new dispensations the hastened breakdown of the rule of law, as the rule of law has been constitutionally established. And these new political dispensations, again, Milei, Trump, really concentrated here in the Western Hemisphere, really, they correspond closely to the economic transformations that have already taken place, which is the unprecedented concentration and centralization of transnational capital on a global scale. So now the political expression of that concentration and centralization of capitalist power are these new political dispensations and a reconfiguration of power blocks, as I mentioned. The old forms of legitimacy, they don't work anymore. Alternative forms of legitimacy are emerging, involving rule by force, by decree, the normalization of mafioso dealings. Since I need to wrap up in about 30 seconds or so, I won't mention Gramsci, but here you can remember what Gramsci said about when a crisis hits in full force, the types of new political forms, state forms that emerge. In the United States, the new ruling bloc, the emerging, it's not consolidated, the emerging power bloc is enjoying creating a crisis intentionally. Let the state collapse, put an end to bourgeois democracy, and then follow the Gazan option, the Salvadoran option, the global police state option. And the state here should be run by artificial intelligence. There's where the algorithms come in. You take privatized Social Security, so it's for profit, it's turned over to the banks to administer, and it's run by artificial intelligence, not by human beings. Finally, I'll shut up with this, that the larger project here, who knows if it will be consolidated because we have to fight back, and May 1st is coming up. But the larger project here is not just to privatize the state, that too, and that's been going on for quite a while, but to create literally a private state. You can look to Prospera in Honduras, and the island, the Caribbean coast island of Honduras. Prospera has been turned over as literally a private mini-state. And that's what these factions of the ruling class want to do with the US state and all around the world. Private corporate states run by artificial intelligence, controlled by the oligarchic peak of the transnational capitalist class. So I will stop there.
Well, thank you, William. There was I couldn't keep up. My hand hurt with the notes, but this was a brilliant analysis because it really did touch on every facet and dimension of this kind of change, from changes in political economy on a global scale to what do the tech bros want in Honduras. And so this is you've answered all kinds of little questions I had when I watched people like Jeffrey Sachs talk about the redrawing of the Middle Eastern maps and other contributors. So thank you for this. And now we could entertain questions from anyone. If you want to either raise your hand or just jump in and ask William what reflections you have on this and what unanswered questions you have since this presentation. Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, fantastic presentation, William. You put it all together, different developments, you linked them together, and one can see the relationship between each one. That was a fantastic job. Specifically with regard to Latin America, Trump has stated and done outrageous things. Canada is the 51st state, annexing Greenland, taking over the Panama Canal. And the question I have is, part of it just seems rhetoric, banter, meaningless, statements and threats, but also making concessions, the art of the deal. And I'm wondering whether, in your analysis, is this mostly about diverting attention from these crises in the United States and throughout the world, or are there specific objectives, specific demands that explain Trump's actions?
Sure. I mean, it's an extremely important question, but not really a question, more a collective discussion point, right? And so, but I think before I respond directly to that, because I think there's a lot more than simple banter and simple Trump's sort of psychopathological way of behaving and, and spitting out comments. I think there's much more to it than that. But I want to say something methodologically for a minute, and it's that one of our challenges as social scientists is to how do we combine the underlying structural dynamics, right, which are much deeper and they're much more historical as they move forward, and then there's qualitative breaks with quantitative changes. How do we combine that with the more surface level political and conjunctural events that take place and things which are completely unpredictable, such as Trump's personality, apart from structurally what he represents occupying the US executive. So I think that's part of, and then that generates confusion, Trump's own idiosyncratic behavior. But no, I think that really there's a lot of substance there. Greenland, underneath Greenland are all of these rare earth minerals, and these rare earth minerals are absolutely essential to the new digital technologies. And as you know, Steve, China right now has a near monopoly in those rare earth minerals. They are also in Ukraine. So you either need peace or you need Ukraine to get on board from the US perspective on turning those rare earth minerals over to corporations, which will send them to the US. But Greenland is sitting on the largest, unbelievable deposits of rare earth minerals. So it doesn't pop up out of nowhere. And it doesn't pop out of nowhere that the tech billionaires are the particular fraction of transnational capital right now, which has virtually captured the executive. And that suddenly you have Trump wants to take Greenland, and there's all these rare earth minerals that those tech corporations need. So I think I think you have to tease through Trump's, again, psychopathological way of saying things and doing things, and what's really going on underneath the surface. So I think, yes, that there is and there's also an attempt to also legitimate new violent forms of appropriation. I mean, the idea that you can just take over Canada or take over Greenland or militarily intervene suddenly in Panama, that was seen as totally illegitimate before November 4, before the US elections last time. And so part of the Trump offensive is to break down what we used to consider illegitimate and try and re-legitimate them through new discourse, through new actions, through a new political dispensations. So it's like, so yes, I think it's much more serious than just Trump's own whatever you want to call it, narcissistic psychopathy, right? I think there's more going on there.
William, I had a question about the infamous Marco Rubio, who is now, in fact, the Secretary of State, because he is a Cuban American and has obviously his own axe to grind. What latitude do you think he has within the administration to promote his own agenda for Latin America vis-a-vis, is he just following orders?
Yeah, I think that there's, and of course I'm on the outside, so but what it seems to me is that there's a lot of flux. There's nothing is stable right now in this administration, if we want to call it that, rather than a regime. So the larger, there's the larger project is not consolidated. And of course, there's a correlation of forces, which is right now, as put in a recent article. And actually, I don't know if I was successful in posting it to the listserv, an article which discusses this. Basically, my presentation followed that article. But I think this is a project which is not consolidated, and it will depend on the correlation of forces and the resistance from below, whether it becomes consolidated or not. But within the context of a very fluid situation in which there are these petty little pockets of power within the regime, within the executive, and they're vying for who's going to have more control and more influence in the midst of a very unstable situation. So at least from what I've been able to follow, Rubio has had to abandon his more straightforward neoconservative, traditional far-right positions and opportunistically operate as Trump's Secretary of State. And I think there are implications there also, but this is too soon to say. I know that, and Steve may know more about this, for instance, with policy towards Venezuela, I know that there's this internal fighting inside the White House. One group wants to not have such a hard line in Venezuela, of course, to have access to the oil and other things. And another group, which is Rubio, wants a hard line on it. So I don't think that that Rubio is in control of the State Department, but I don't think that any individuals are in the controlling the different branches of the executive in the way that they would like to. It's all very much up in the air.
Go ahead, Tomas or Christy.
Yeah, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I'm thinking of Milei and Milei's situation right now, and the head of the FMI the other day kind of blew it and said that he's gonna give Milei $20 billion, and that would assure that he wouldn't win the next election. No, pretty much saying that she's paying for his campaign, political campaign, but his support is kind of dwindling. Some voters have left his party and are probably not going to vote for him for the next election. So that leads me to think that how do you think, and I don't know if you're thinking about these issues, but how do you think workers, common people, middle class, lower middle class people can react to this situation where they feel so bombarded by everything, no? A lack of job, instability, losing money in their pension funds, social support, social networks, corruption. There's so much, no, that it's coming to everyone. How do you think people will react to this situation? Is there any chance, possibility that if someone wins the next election, Milei is defeated, is there any chance to confront what we're facing?
Yeah, great question and extremely important. And Milei and what's going on right now in Argentina is very instructive. It's a micro example of these larger processes going on all around the world. So let's look at this for a minute. The IMF comes and they rescue Milei, and they do more than that. The IMF not just economically has just rescued Milei, but called on the Argentine people to vote for him again in the midterm elections. So what the IMF represents here is the transnational capitalist class. Again, there's all contradictions inside the transnational capitalist class, but we can still use it as an analytical and conceptual category. And behind the transnational capitalist class, I've been theorizing about what I call the transnational state apparatuses for a very long time. And people think I'm talking about a global government. I never have been. I've been talking about how these institutions like the IMF operate as an instrument of transnational capital to impose itself on states. Right. And so you see that with crystal clarity with the IMF and with Milei right now in Argentina. But then the other thing you see in Argentina is the general strikes. I mean, that was so inspirational. We need that here in the US. And so again, there's the correlation of forces in favor of Milei is not consolidated. And that's why we have an opening right now in which a mass struggle from below can reverse or can hold back a favorable correlation of forces which has been favorable for the Milei fraction of the ruling groups. But so here's the other thing, though, to mention that what this tells us is that the ruling class projects, there's not one, but the hegemonic one now is these new groups, right? The ruling class projects are facing unbelievable and insurmountable contradictions. And we need to know how to exploit those contradictions. So here in the US, Trumpism has a mass base in sectors of the working class. People say it's the white workers, but that's not true. That's more complicated than that. I won't get into that. But the point is that tens of millions of workers in the United States voted for Trump, and those workers need Social Security and they need Medicare. And the Trump program is going after that. So that's an contradiction. That's an internal contradiction that's not resolvable. So this is all extremely explosive. We're in a moment of an extremely explosive situation. That is also why we face this danger. And I hope it doesn't come down to this in the US. It's already in El Salvador and in Ecuador, is that these new states declare states of exception, states of emergency. And they become kind of semi-permanent. How long has it been in El Salvador now? 2 years? I've lost track. Well, 2 years at least, the state of emergency, state of exception. In Ecuador, what has been 14, 15 months, I think. Again, I lose track of the actual time. But those states like this, contradictions are explosive. And when us from below aggravates those contradictions with a struggle from below, that's where states of exception can kick in, and that's a real danger. That's why also what we're seeing, there's these big debates, is this authoritarianism, is this right-wing populism, is this fascism? But really, for me, it's a 21st century fascism is where things are pointing if we don't block that from consolidating. So I hope those insights are helpful. But there's a lot of hope, and I don't know how many of you are in the screen or inside the US, but you may remember that we had about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, I think it was, we had a day called Hands Off. And we went, I'm in LA. We went, my wife and I went, and we were shocked at 50,000 people that came out in downtown LA. And these people, because I've been going to all the Palestine demonstrations, all of the immigrant justice demonstrations, since I've been in LA. But here, when folks that you never see, they look like they were typically apolitical, and they're suddenly awoken because they say, "Oh, I'm going to lose my Social Security. I'm about to retire." And they were older people. They weren't just kids, young people, like the BLM uprising. So there's a whole lot of hope, and there's an opening now for resistance before this project can consolidate.
Thank you.
If I could raise something, you certainly showed some powerful forces sending us to hell, but I think there are some countersigns. We don't have to buy a ticket to Mars quite yet. Even in China, they now talk about dual circulation economy, and this idea spreading elsewhere, where they say, "Yeah, we may need to produce more at home, less on the world market." So there's this counter tendency, and even in the German election, which looks so conservative, the left actually made significant gains, although the conservatives probably even more. That there's counter indications going around that it may not quite be doomsday quite yet.
Right. No, completely. And actually, that's exactly what I'm stressing, that we're not at doomsday, that we're in this moment of instability in which many different things can happen. And so I've been suggesting for the last really, especially since 2008, since the financial collapse of 2008, which put us into a new terrain, that we're seeing a polarization worldwide. The center's collapsing, and we're seeing a polarization between popular forces from below, sometimes expressed as the left in government, very often, usually not, and the far right, and this political and social polarization. And so, of course, the offensive of Milei and of Trump and of Noboa, etc., is the offensive on the right wings, the far right side of this polarization, this political polarization. But we, on the left side, on the popular side, we also have our offensives, mentioning the general strike in Argentina, mentioning the mass anti-fascist upsurge right before the German elections, which influenced the outcome of those elections. So exactly, as these contradictions play out, we very much are not yet at that doomsday that, as you put it. Very much this is an open game.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Rosalind.
Yeah, well, one thing Trump clearly fantasizes about is actually mobilizing the US military to impose whatever his desires are, to create a martial law, state of exception, declare himself president-elect, whatever. To what extent is the US military any kind of an obstacle? I mean, we're seeing that some of the repressive apparatus is clearly totally Trumpist, but is there any sort of possibility of them confronting real resistance within the core of the repressive apparatus?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And something very scary, although of course we're not in the inside of the Pentagon and the US state to get an insider's look. But remember that Trump fired this whole set of generals and high-level Pentagon officials. And so there's a story there. I mean, we don't know it because we're on the outside, but it certainly looks on the outside like he wants to make sure that there's no resistance inside the Pentagon to their program. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be extremely unusual if there weren't these unbelievable tensions internal to the US state, the high levels of the US state, that we're not privy to because we're on the outside. We're outside and we're below, right? So yeah, I would be very surprised if there was not massive disaffection and possibility of resistance from the Pentagon. And of course, there's been these signs that some sectors of those that are controlling the US state, and of course the Israeli state, want to launch a war with Iran. And then there's signs that there's been pushback within the highest levels of the US state to that. So again, I think we're in this moment of flux, and nothing is certain, nothing is clear, nothing is in blueprints yet, right?
William, there are two articles that I'm a fiendish on collecting articles. This one is in Foreign Policy. This Trump administration is shaping up to be Latin America first. And interestingly, our very own Steve Elner's article, Donald Trump is weakening U.S. influence in Latin America. To what extent is there a good possibility that what Trump is provoking is a pivot in among those regimes in Latin America that aren't paid for? New York Times went and attacked Claudia Sheinbaum the other day. They love to do that because she mentioned in a speech that maybe Mexico's option after free trade and neoliberalism have failed is to import substitution industrialization, that good old model, which might, given its historical failure, but now its possibilities, China is also talking about import substitution industrialization. Is it possible that Trump could provoke a pivoting in domestic economic policy with significant economies like China, I would say
Right.
Mexico?
Well, separate China from Latin America because China is a case to itself, right? But this is why when I was talking, I said it's so important for us. Of course, the political and the economic are always connected. They're not separate from each other. But we have to analytically, we have to separate state. So I think Steve is right that U.S. state is losing its political influence in Latin America. But that's been going on for a long time. And the utter arrogance of what Trump has done over the last couple of months has antagonized all of these political forces, except for the extreme right like Milei and Noboa and Bukele in Latin America. So that's all true. And it hastened the CELAC meeting in Honduras. That's all true, but that's at the level of states. So that's why I was saying in my analysis, we can combine it afterwards, but first we have to separate out what's going on with capital and what's going on with the states. So I don't see this type of self-centered and import substitution. I don't see any of those economic projects on the horizon in Latin America or anywhere, because you have except China. We have to talk about China in just a minute, but we have such a globally integrated economy that there's no country can withdraw from it or create its own internal, national state economy, which is outside of global capitalism. And as long as you're so deeply integrated into global capitalism, the social reproduction of each national formation is totally dependent on the larger global capitalist system, and that global capitalist system is in crisis. So that politically, the Latin American states can come together in another round of CELAC or set up an alternative to the OAS, but that won't change the situation with global capitalism and its crisis. So Scheinbaum, Mexico, and I know all of these debates have been going on for a long time. Is AMLO and Scheinbaum, are they really the left, or should they be criticized and not criticized? But no, for me, it's really clear what she's doing politically with regard to the U.S. Is good to a certain extent, but the Morena has actually opened up the door for a radical expansion of extractivism and infrastructural an infrastructural capitalist seizure in southern Mexico, in the Yucatan in southern Mexico, so I think we have to start by separating. That's why I said realism. Realism has a lot to offer, but then we have to go beyond the realist analysis. But finally, I also want to say that in Latin America, you really have three groups. You have the progressive governments. I'm not going to call them left, but they're certainly progressive, such as Colombia, such as Scheinbaum, Bolivia, in trouble. All of these, governments are in trouble. You have the far right, which is part of this new fraction of the global ruling class, which is Bukele, et cetera. And then you have the other ones, the other ones like Guatemala, like Costa Rica. So it's really a more complex situation, I think, than all of Latin America, even uniting right now politically. I hope that's helpful observations.
Andy, you had your hand up. Oh, sorry, we waited to get to you.
Oh, excuse me, just 1 second. I just forgot to say, but the U.S. is, from a realist perspective of politics and state influence, the U.S. is not only losing influence in Latin America, but all around the world. I mean, we all know that. We're moving towards a multipolar world. There's powerful countries, especially China, challenging U.S. political dominance. So what Steve says about Latin America is absolutely true, and it's true for the whole world at this time.
No, I'll leave my question to the side. I'd like to hear this piece about China as its own specific case. I'm thinking of like some of the world systems people had discussed China's role as possibly a future hegemon. So I'd like to hear what you were going to say about them.
So if we look at nation states, obviously China is going to be the #1 global economy. It almost is. We're going to have these radical, and I come from the world systems tradition. That broke a little bit with some of world systems, for me, a little bit of left-wing realism, but still, that's my tradition. But the U.S. dollar cannot continue as the world currency, and that's very brittle. The U.S. dollar is the world currency right now. That's part of the Trump story also, to rescue the U.S. dollar. But that's doomed. It can end in 2 years. It can end in 12 years. But clearly, and the U.S. is not going to be the market of last resort, and the tariffs are only going to aggravate that. So historically, as the world systems people point out, we have these series of hegemonic transitions, right? From the Iberian Peninsula to the Dutch, from the Dutch to the English, from the English to the United States. And now the world systems people say, well, China's the next big hegemon. But I have a disagreement with that, not the historic side. But what is the role historically of the hegemon? It's been to anchor the world capital system, right? To stabilize it. And of course, stabilize it in a very violent way. Stabilize it in which it's always expanding, it's always appropriating, it's always exploiting. So China may become the #1 dominant power, again, seen from the state, from the perspective of states. But I don't think China is going to be able to stabilize global capitalism. I think that the contradictions internal to a globalized capitalism have reached a point where no hegemonic anchor is going to be able to play that role of stability that the US played in the 20th century, that the UK played in the 19th century, and so on. I'm suggesting, and of course, we'll see, I just have a book in press, but the title of it is Epical Crisis, which I mentioned in my talk. The subtitle is The Exhaustion of Global Capitalism. So I think we're moving into this worldwide crisis. We've had these other crises. The last one, of course, were the two world wars, et cetera. You know, the two world wars of the early 20th century. But now we're moving into this type of world systemic crisis, in a qualitatively new situation in which global capitalism has going to have a very hard time to renew itself. I don't see it. And of course, we'll all be dead before, those of us that are older, before we can confirm my prediction here.
Can I ask a follow-up then on this?
Yeah.
Because okay, so there's two pieces to this. One is there's been a recent use of this term neo-feudalism. Jody Dean, Giannis, I'm wary of it because I think feudalism has specific connotations to it and characteristics. So I'm wondering, is this kind of a multipolar thing that moves in that direction? Is this world empires as a multipolar world where we just have different regional sub-imperialisms that are operating? I guess, yeah, when you say multipolar and what that looks like under this crisis condition, what's the picture that you would paint at this moment? Not to say you have to hold to it, forever.
Sure. Well, yeah, well, two things. The first is that multipolar in terms of political, but that's the thing, that in India, China, the BRICS, however you want to look at multipolarity, right? There's these emerging political centers to world capitalism, which are exercising increasing political weight and which is challenging the ability of the US to politically impose itself all around the world. And that we should expect as we move out of a period of hegemonic stability, to use the language of, of world systems theory and of the left wing of realism theory, and towards this period of instability. And so we have a multipolar world politically. But the thing is that all of these different political poles of world capitalism are fully integrated into this integrated global economy. And can't extricate themselves and are not proposing to extricate themselves from the global economy. And so you have this geopolitical competition and conflict at the same time that you have this global economic interdependence so interwoven that it's not going to become undone. We're not going to go back into even, so some people may predict it, I can't agree with it, into isolated regional and national economies. That's not going to happen. But there's something else I want to mention here, and it's that this notion of techno-feudalism or neo-feudalism, whatever you want to call it, it's so ridiculous theoretically. I'm that Varoufakis would say something like that. A brilliant Marxist economist, that it's not feudalism. It's a totally different relation of production with feudalism for a totally different moment in history. This is capitalism. What this is a new forms of capitalism. Capitalism is constantly developing and changing, and it's morphing into a new type of capitalism. A new type of capitalism, which first of all is digital, secondly has unprecedented concentration and centralization of capital on a world scale, and third is financial. So you have the ability of finance capital to extract surplus value from industrial and other types of capital accumulation. And it's that extraction which is going from one fraction of capital within the transnational capitalist conglomerates to another fraction of capital. That's a transfer of, so us as workers, we generate surplus value. It goes to those that directly appropriate it from us. But then after it's first appropriated, by the first tier of appropriation, finance capital and now tech capital appropriates a good portion of that surplus value. And it's that movement which Varoufakis is saying is feudalism, because it looks like rents. Well, it is rents, but in a capitalist sense. So it's absurd to say this is, feudalism. That really doesn't help us. It's just a descriptive observation of the grabbing of surplus value by capitalist groups that haven't directly exploited labor to get it. That makes sense.
Good point. Well, go ahead, Rosalind.
Yeah, well, I know the first point you mentioned, and you said you weren't going to get into it, is ecological collapse. But we are facing an environmental catastrophe. And how do you see that factoring into everything else that's going on?
Yeah, well, it's factoring into everything in numerous levels. So the first thing is that a lot, for instance, the transnational migration, the whole communities are collapsing. And they're collapsing not just because of the environment, but that too. So you have this massive outmigration from Central America, in the last few decades. And I'm not an ecological specialist, but I know there's great books have been written on this collapse of the Central American environment, ecology, and how outmigration from Honduras is so intimately linked to the collapse of environments, of ecologies in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and in Guatemala. So that's the first thing, is that the crisis of social reproduction is so intimately linked to the ecological and the environmental crisis. The other thing is that, and this is what's so dangerous, is that, again, capital is desperate to crack open new spaces and find new ways of accumulating. And so one of them has been to commodify nature. And that's these land grabs all around the world. Again, Peru is in first place, but Indonesia and Malaysia are close in second, and so is the Congo, right? And so what are you doing is now the attack on nature is not just because you have to clear a forest to get at minerals. It's that too, and that's intensifying. But the attack on nature is also to convert nature into a financial asset. So there are all of these different dimensions in which, and by the way, and this I definitely won't get into, it's too abstract, but when we talk about nature, of course, we're talking about the global proletariat too, because we human beings are part of nature, and there's these contradictions. But I would say that the ecological dimensions of the crisis of global capitalism is triggering and feeding into the other three dimensions in a way which is dangerously synergistic, extremely dangerously synergistic. And the endless accumulation of capital is now running up against the finite character of the biosphere. So we've reached those tipping points that ecologists have already showed us that. But the ecologists, I'm adding on to it that the ecological dimension and its actual impact touching down in communities is accelerating those other three dimensions of crisis.
Ward, you're muted, Ward. Unmute. You're still muted. It keeps muting.
Maybe you've seen too, news in California that kind of a new wrinkle in immigration is the highly skilled Asians, particularly going out to the Bay Area. I guess it's more in Northern California, and less of the low-skilled labor we tend to associate with migration. And is this a little episode for California, or do you see this happening worldwide, that there'll be more of a high-skilled migration going on?
Yeah, I don't know about worldwide, but I think one reason it's in California is because Silicon Valley is here in California. But a couple of things on that regard. One is that I just received yesterday a text from someone whose good friend is an industrial engineer with I don't know if it's Google or Apple or Microsoft. I don't remember which of one of the big ones. But this industrial engineer, or a tech engineer, predicted that in 2 to 3 years there'll be no more need for digital engineers in Silicon Valley. Obviously, he's exaggerating, but the point is that the giant tech conglomerates in Silicon Valley want the skilled labor, and so now you have the gold visa, gold. What is it called? Trump's calling it the gold card, which is permanent residency if you pay $5 million, and also the tech billionaires have already expressed that they do not want restrictions on skilled labor. But the larger story is that, except for the most extreme of those skilled labor, which are really more than just proletarians, they are going to be redundant very soon. They're going to be redundant too. But I don't see worldwide there will be a significant upsurge in extremely skilled labor migrating around the planet. I think we've seen that over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I don't think there's an uptick. On the contrary, I think the migrations we will see are people that want to take refuge in fortresses, right? But for social and political reasons, not because they're selling their skilled labor to these fortresses.
Go ahead, Steve.
William, I'm interested in your take on the legitimacy crisis that you mentioned, and you mentioned in all your writings. Is it, do you have in mind a instrumentalist viewpoint in which the economic crisis that you discuss, the state, the ruling class ends up doing things that are not in accordance with their interests? You mentioned the economic groups that are opposed to Trump's tariffs. Is a legitimate crisis something that affects the ruling class, and sectors of the ruling class end up pursuing certain policies that are not in accordance with your interests? Or do you have in mind a, Polancis type vision in which different classes and different fractions of classes, they're in a crisis situation, and that crisis situation reflects itself at the state level?
Yeah, well, I think both of them, those are not mutually exclusive. I think they're both of those perspectives you just put forward can complement each other, and they're both at work at this point. But let me respond more theoretically for a minute. And it's that in my analysis, the capitalist state has a contradictory mandate. Of course, this draws on Poulancis, but it's not identical to Poulancis. It draws on Gramsci and not identical to Gramsci. But it's that this contradictory mandate, the state, the capitalist state at the level of the nation state, because actually, let me take the story back a second. A contradiction internal to this globalized age of capitalism, a contradiction internal to it is you have an integrated global economy within a system of political authority, which involves 200 sovereign nation states, at least formally sovereign. And so you have this scattered political authority, but an integrated global economy, and that's a contradiction. And each capitalist nation state has to do two things. Each has to attract transnationally mobile capital to its own territory. So that's why Trump says, I'm putting up tariffs so that corporations can come and invest in the United States. He's not blocking capital from coming into the US. He's trying to attract capital into the US. Xi Jinping is still trying to attract transnational capital into China. Although, again, you have a more complex situation. We still don't need to discuss China in further detail. But all around the world, states have to attract transnationally mobile capital. And all states and the whole of humanity is dependent on transnational capital at this point for our own social reproduction, for our existence. But then the other function of the capitalist state, which is in direct contradiction with that function, is its legitimacy function. The capitalist state has to achieve some sort of legitimacy inside its own national territory. So inside the US, what does Trump have to do, or who's ever sitting in the White House, whichever running the US state? They have to set up policies to attract capital to come in. And what are those policies? Low wages, lift environmental regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? All of these policies to attract capital, for capital to say, oh, it's better for us to invest in the US than in Japan, Germany, or China, right? And on the other hand, the same US state has to pulverize the working class, has to do all these things to please capital, which then has the state lose its legitimacy with the working masses. And so there's the entrance to the legitimacy crisis, and it's a contradiction internal to global capitalism. So, part of the big story that why did Trump win these elections? Well, because the state and the two traditional parties are not seen as legitimate anymore, that the working classes, multi-ethnic, multinational working class in the US, utterly disgusted with the so-called establishment, with the system, doesn't see it as legitimate. Trump is able to manipulate that come in from the outside, saying, I'm going to challenge the powers that be, I'm going to challenge Washington, I'm going to go after the deep state. So it's a form, of course, profound political manipulation. And of course, you're playing on scapegoating and racism for that story. But what I'm trying to get at is that's a contradiction internal to the US state and to all capitalist states between legitimacy and attracting transnational capital and assuring that capital accumulates in your territory. And there's no resolution to that contradiction. So right now, Trump, the recent polls that just came out yesterday, maybe some of you saw it, that Trump is like plummeting in the polls, including among those that voted for him. But just to conclude, if you want to be theoretical about it, I think that to take Poulancis, there is the power block that was in power, but sort of crumbling throughout the 2010s, that power block, not hegemonic block, but power block, Poulancis power block, has now crumbled. It's not there. and Trumpism is trying to construct a new power block within the state. But that doesn't resolve its need to deal with this contradiction, which is not resolvable.
Mm.
May I jump in? William, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm interested, before you came on board, we were talking a little bit, everybody was talking about their own participation in events in protest to Trump's doing this and that. And there seemed to be some optimism about the possibility of changing things, given time, following normal formal democracy, and maybe with the next elections, things will turn around. I'm not terribly optimistic about formal democracy. I'm very interested in participatory democracy. But do you see that possibility as an outcome?
Yeah. So my big fear, yes, well, definitely, but yeah, I mean, we go through these electoral cycles. So if you're asking an outcome, meaning that the Democrats will come back to power in 3, well, yes, but I have two things to say about that. One is, it's not clear to me that if this fascist or neo-fascist power block consolidates, that it's going to have free elections, at least, in a bourgeois sense, free elections in 2028. I'm not convinced about that at all. That's what I'm saying. If we don't change the correlation of forces from below and make it impossible, these people are going to declare a state of exception, right? And that's what we have to avoid. But if they declare a state of exception, then who knows if there'll be elections in 2028. But let's say there are elections. Let's say there's enough resistance from below and the political circumstances doesn't allow them to do that. And we have elections. Sure, the Democrats will come back to power. But right now, the Democratic Party is in complete crisis. And right now, there's the Bernie and the AOC wing, and it's really disturbing because their message is extremely important, in my view, at least. It's really mobilizing significant sectors of the working class, what they're saying, against a billionaire oligarchy. But they're doing that, and they've made clear, in order to bring people back to the Democratic Party. And all that's going to do, if that happens, and if the Democrats win in 2028, is buy us a little more time before the crisis explodes even further. But then, of course, this is my personal political position. But yeah, I'm interested in participatory democracy, but I'm also interested in a third party. I'm also interested, I don't think you can really, at this point, capture the Democratic Party for a for a democratic socialist left. This is our personal political views now, right? But yeah, I don't know what else to say about that.
I appreciate that. I agree with you. But there's this optimism in the opposition that somehow this is the way out.
Yeah, it's not, definitely not. It's just buying time if it happens.
I think so.
Go ahead, Andy. Your hand was up. Or was?
I had a question in mind, and then my kid walked up and asked me to check if he was feeling okay, and I totally forgot what it was. So I apologize. I'm gonna let it slide.
Voila.
George, I have another question. And I think we're kind of winding up, probably because we're getting close to 5:30. But we've been talking this afternoon about, and maybe you saw the agenda, we've been talking about problems that as a journal we face, ways we can become, have more ways we can involve the public more in what the journal is doing. One of the directions that was brought up is somewhat similar to what you did with Nicaragua, where you focused on Nicaragua and its problems by generating an essay from a colleague and then getting commentaries on that, which I thought was an interesting approach. Our problem is the distractions of the world around, possibly. I can't determine. I think I am a little bit more optimistic than and some members of this group that there is interest in Latin America, plenty of interest to attract them to our journal and to courses on Latin America and so on. Perhaps you have an observation about that, but really, one of the things that came up was trying to generate maybe in a thematic issue, which itself is somewhat limiting in terms of drawing people toward the journal, maybe in some place raising an issue or a question that's contemporary, that is part of an ongoing debate, and that stimulates interest. We have political education, which this is, which some of which have been very successful in that regard. But what we're doing internally is not getting outside to influence and draw people toward us. I wonder if you have any thoughts about all that, what we could be doing in the future.
Yeah, and before I share my thoughts, I should apologize because I didn't attend the breakout sessions earlier today. But I want to share with a couple of things. One is share the experience that we've had at the Journal of World Systems Research. The advantage, of course, we have in that journal is that it's online. There's no hard copy, so things go quicker. But the last round, and the editorship passes from one campus to another, from one group within the World Systems community to another. But the one that had it for the last few years created a new section. So divided the journal, not necessarily in half, but the traditional peer-reviewed articles, research articles, and then the second part of the journal is commentary. And the commentary doesn't have to be peer-reviewed. It has to be reviewed by editors, but it doesn't have to be peer-reviewed, so it comes out much quicker, and it can address flashpoint issues, such as what's going on right now with Trumpism and the crisis. It's not the same as a research article that needs a shelf life of 10, 15 years and that slowly gets published. So I don't know with LAP if something like that, a section which is commentary, and it can be quite analytical, quite even theoretical, but it can also be looser commentaries and analyses that have more of a political flavor and more of a conjunctural flavor. That's one thing to attract people to the journal. Of course, the problem is it's still a hard copy journal, right? It's a print journal, and that's still slow. So I don't know how helpful that.
We're actually more than a print journal. I'd say 90% of our readers are digital.
Right. Yes. Right. So yeah. So I think articles that can be quickly go through the editorial process and get published digitally or eventually even in print is a very attractive model.
I appreciate that view. We had another example a few years ago. Katz in Argentina wrote a piece on Latin America in the future and the issues to be confronted and addressed. And it was a long piece. It was like 20,000 words when he presented it. And we asked him to cut it to 15,000 words and then actually worked 5 commentaries around it. I thought it was a really interesting issue because it was dealing with now and the future and the big issues.
Right. Yeah. That's the other thing also, these symposiums with a lead article and then commentaries around it. That's also, I think, that attracts a lot of attention. It's also always a very attractive thing to do. And certainly we could do it more often.
Question, we still have time?
Sure, you got 5 minutes.
Oh, well, you mentioned that profits are down since 1990s, but I was doing some research on return on equity, and it seems to be at the usual historic levels. And accumulation of money in offshore accounts seems to be at record levels. That I was wondering what source you're using for falling profits. It seems to me it's just usual monopoly capital greed, of course, always pushing it in new areas and so on.
Yeah. Well, the offshore accounts right there is also a sign that is telling us that there's capital which is looking for a place to rest, to perch itself, right, and to accumulate through rents, capitalist rents. So the expansion of these offshore accounts is actually a sign of accumulation crisis. But as far as the data I'm using, it's really widespread. I mean, to begin, so you can, if you want, and also the problem is, remember that this is what I've always critiqued as nation state centric analysis. And my critics think I'm saying that we shouldn't pay attention to individual nation states. I've never said that. But what I mean by nation state analysis is the profit rate may go up in the United States for a time. It may go down in the United States. It may go up in Germany, down in Germany. It may go up in South Africa, down in South Africa. But you have to look at the whole global economy. Michael Roberts, what is it, Robert Michael? What is it? Michael Robert, right? He's an economist. I'm suddenly forgetting his name, but he's a really brilliant economist, so he's just focusing on the US, but he has a wealth of data on the secular decline of the profit rate. Of course, it can go up in one year, down in the next year, but there's a secular decline, and it's crystal clear. And then I as well as Steve, we're members of the editorial board of Science and Society. And I remember it was Julio Huato or who on the editorial board, Steve, published with 3 other authors, the 4 of them, this fantastic article that aggregated data from all countries in the world into an aggregate database and showed the secular decline of the global rate of profit. Again, if you break down an individual nation state, you may see it go up in one nation state, down in another one. But so there's a wealth of data really indicating the decline of the rate of profit despite temporary swings over the last 30 some odd years. But I also have to say, we have to remember also that the rate of profit for an individual corporation is not necessarily the general rate of profit, the average rate of profit. So Apple at some moment might have super profits. The whole concept of super profits is that one corporation or one sector of the economy is taking excess profits, grabbing surplus value from another sector. So if you look at the rate of profit in those particular sectors, it may be high, but it's not the average rate of profit. And that's what's key, at least in the Marxist political economy, is the average rate of profit.
Get my books out of storage. Well, William, thank you for this. Has been a really wonderful hour plus, and very thought-provoking, and it does really obligate us to go back and look at a lot of our Marxist theory and concepts that we've, in my case, need some refreshing. It shows you the importance of political economy and social analysis, and to what extent we really need it as a clarifying optic that we otherwise would obfuscate with. I won't go there. It's now 5:30. I think we are done. If anybody would like to add any comments, our next meeting is actually during Lhasa. It's on May 26th, which is Memorial Day, and that will be our live meeting from San Francisco.